I would like to acknowledge the Bedegal people that are the traditional custodians of this land. I would also like to pay my respects to the elders, both past and present, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island who are present today. My name is Professor Carmel Pisa, and I'm absolutely honoured and delighted to chair this session, Ageism and Us, hosted by the University of New South Wales Ages and Futures Institute. The Institute, directed by Professor Karen Anstey, was established to support interdisciplinary research and address real-world issues in ageing. If ever there was a real-world issue right now, and particularly in the COVID pandemic, is ageism. We've come to see it time and time again, and it's ever more florid. Ageism is a stereotyping, prejudice and discrimination against people on the basis of their age. Ageism is widespread in society and, as I've just said, ever more present, and can greatly impact older people from living a meaningful life, whether this be being overlooked for employment, being stereotyped in the media, and I'm sure all you've seen all the horrific media statements in the face of the pandemic, and being seen as a burden on the health system and the economy. Today, we are lucky enough to hear from a fabulous, diverse panel of leading experts who will present and discuss different perspectives on the impact of ageism on individuals and society. So once we hear from all four speakers, we'll have a final discussion and a Q&A session. So if you could hold off your questions during the presentation, but type them into the Zoom chat box and we'll endeavour to answer them during the final Q&A session. So first off, I'd like to introduce Mr. Mick Gooda. Mick Gooda's people are the Ghangulu and the Yiman of Central Queensland. He was the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders Social Justice Commissioner of the Australian Human Rights Commission from 2010 to 2016. He was then appointed Co-Commissioner on the Royal Commission into the Protection and Detention of Children in the Northern Territory. Prior to 2010, he was the Chief Executive Officer of the Cooperative Research Centre for Aboriginal Health, where he drove a research agenda which placed Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people front and centre. Today, Mr. Gooda is going to speak about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander persons and ageism. Thank you for joining us, Mick, and welcome.
Mick, you're on mute.
I reckon that's going to be the word of the year now. You're on mute. But can I acknowledge the traditional owners all over Australia where people are placed listening and participating in this webinar. I'm actually not on my country. I'm on Mulunjali country, just southwest of Brisbane. So I acknowledge the Mulunjali people for allowing me to be here. I guess first thing, we always pay tribute to elders, but I'd like to also, when we talk about ageism, I think we've got to make a real distinction here, that the difference between elders and old people. I'd say most old Aboriginal people would be counted as elders, but you can also be an elder and be relatively young in the terms of society today. If a person has a particular duty within his or her mob, like a protector of a cultural place, a place of significance, or they might be what we call out in Central Australia, nonkaris who are healers. They actually get selected as young babies to be grown into that job, and once they've been through the initiation rites, they are considered elders. So I just want to make that distinction, because we're not talking about the same thing when we talk about elders and old Aboriginal people. The issue with Close the Gap, I've always thought this, that once we start closing the gap and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people live a bit longer, we're now going to be subject to some of the health issues that we probably haven't been subject to. And some of the figures coming out now are almost horrendous when you look at things like dementia and Alzheimer's. And it seems, again, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, once they reach that age, are now going to suffer Alzheimer's or dementia at a far greater rate than the general population. And we've got to think about what services we need to provide to Aboriginal and Torres Strait older people, because it's about only 1% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people live in aged care facilities. Most Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are cared for at home by family or friends or other means of support while they're in the home. So a lot of our mob are in the home, and we've got to actually start thinking about how do we actually provide those services to a far greater number of people who will be needing those sort of services as they get older. And there's only a small percentage of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people over 65. But the predictions for, say, in about 2030, that figure is expected to grow by about 200%. So we're going to become the largest growing cohort of old people in Australia. And when you look at what we already don't access, it's things like the facilities, the aged care facilities. We don't access them as much as non-Indigenous people, and therefore we've got to think about what services we need as we get older. But that's on the service provision side. The other thing that really worries me, and it's one of those things we don't like to talk about. I don't think we like to talk about it more generally, but we've got to be more open about this, is elder abuse. And I think the great potential for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to be abused as they get older is I don't think we have any figures on it at the moment, but I think it'll be at least equal to non-Indigenous people. And it's not like a rush of information that comes to me, but I get a fair few phone calls from people who have either been abused themselves or they've got relatives being abused. So I think this growing issue in Australia around elder abuse, whether it's physical abuse, financial abuse, emotional abuse, is really coming to the fore now, and more and more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are talking to people like me about it. So I think what we're going to see is the general thing of what's happening with non-Indigenous Australia is going to happen with us, except if we've got to, if the past informs us of the future, it will generally mean our people are going to be affected more and more as a cohort of people within the Australian population. And as we get older, and I'm sort of heading that way. And next month I turn 64, so I've got 1 year to go before I join that over 65 mob. I've got to start thinking about those issues. And one issue it was when I was getting close to retirement, and I got a guy that looks after my money. He's been advising me for the last 20 years or more about how to plan for post-retirement. And I had this choice about taking a lump sum, taking half lump sum, half pension or full pension, which would have been great, except I'm now at that age where I don't have any dependents that would be counted for superannuation purposes. And my advisor said to me, Dwayne said to me, if I said, I'd really like to take the full pension. And he said, but Mick, look at the record of you mob. You die early, and once you die, all that money goes back into basically consolidated revenue. Your family don't get access to it. So I had to make not a decision based on my economic circumstances about how I would plan for post-retirement, but on the fact that we die earlier, and therefore I took half lump sum, so I've got a sum of money sitting somewhere, and half pension. So it really struck me at that point, as we get older, some of these decisions we've got to make are really different to what the circumstances are really different to what the rest of the population make. So I just wanted to point out some of those differences. I also would like to end on a really nice note. I was in the Northern Territory recently, and the number of really old people there, and how they're doted upon by their young people is just so great to watch. And I think, apart from elder abuse and all those other things I spoke about, I think my aim is to actually get back to that how we looked after people prior to colonisation, and that's what marks us as a bit different. So I think we shouldn't concentrate too much on the bad things that are going to happen. I think we should, it's almost going to what we generally call the strength-based approach. Look at what the strengths are in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community and build on those, how we support people, how we support families looking after someone else. And I reckon that would be a whole lot better than just trying to fix up all the bad things that we do. So, Carmel, I'll probably end there. I don't want to rave on, but just wait for the chance to address some of those questions that are coming.
Mick, I don't want you to stop. I'm mesmerised. I'm supposed to be, I can't help myself. I'm supposed to be concentrating and sharing. I'm going to have a bunch of questions. I'm just going to steal the floor from the audience. That was so mesmerising. Thank you so much. Now, next up, an equally mesmerising person is Professor Andrew Burns. Professor Burns is a human rights lawyer and advocate from the University of New South Wales Faculty of Law and the Australian Human Rights Institute. His current work focuses on the need to develop a comprehensive and coherent framework for the protection of the human rights of older persons at the international and national level. Professor Burns is also an associate investigator at the University of New South Wales Ageing Futures Institute, who brought you this webinar. Today's topic from Andrew is Ageism in the Law, the inadequacies of international and national law.
Okay, thank you very much, Carmel. Let me, and to share my screen with you. Is that working? No. It's not working. It was working before. So I'm not sure what is going on here. Try one more time. Okay, look, I think I'm having some difficulties here, so I think I will just proceed without the PowerPoint. And I acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from Gadigal land, and I'd also like to dedicate my comments this morning to my mother, who's been through some very tough times recently, including encountering entrenched ageist practices. The questions that I want to touch on today are four. The first is, what role do law and legal institutions play in legitimating and reinforcing ageism, but also in providing tools to battle against it? How do international law and Australian law understand, conceptualise and define ageism? And to what extent does Australian law recognise ageism and provide protections against it on an individual and society-wide basis? And finally, does international law place any obligation on governments or others to do something about ageism? As a preliminary point, of course, it's worth making the point that law is often both implicit in oppression as well as a means for responding and remedying it. So I think we're back here. So can you see that screen now? Yep, okay. So law is obviously intimately linked to, reflective of and reinforces ageism in our broader society, but also provides a form of resistance and support in the struggle against ageism, though ambiguously so, given the many exemptions in the legal regimes and the lack of an overriding legal guarantee of anti-ageist policy and practice. So the embodiment or the representation of law in legal regimes, I've sort of broken down into three fairly crude categories. One where ageism is embedded in legal doctrines and practices, the whole discussion around issues of legal capacity generally of older persons, and in specific areas such as testamentary dispositions and other areas, what I've called the doctrinal aspect. Secondly, and more broadly, ageism, as we'll see, or we've already heard and we'll see more later today, is embedded in policies that are given legal force and legitimated by legislation. The whole retirement structure, the differences in age access to NDIS, social security arrangements, tax arrangements, aged care, a whole range of ageist assumptions are built into and embedded and supported by legislation. And then finally, in the focus that I want to, the topic I want to focus on today is ageism as the target of preventive or remedial law, particularly in the form of age discrimination legislation. So the regulatory or resistance aspects of international law. As I'm sure you're all more than familiar, we have now for a number of decades had anti-discrimination law in the field of age discrimination. The Commonwealth level and in every state and territory, there's discrimination law that provides some protection in certain areas against discrimination on the basis of age. Now, it all applies not just to older age, but also to younger age. And I guess that leads us into that broader debate about the concept of ageism and whether it should be defined purely in terms of older age or whether it needs to be a broader notion of which older age ageism is a component. You're too young for this job and you're too old for this job, or you haven't got the right characteristics, you don't know how to have fun. In the case of one airline, I think was the characteristic that was used to knock an older person out. It is interesting though, despite the fact we have this substantial body of legislation, the words ageism or ageist don't appear, at least I couldn't find them on a search anywhere in Commonwealth primary or secondary legislation, or indeed in any of the territory or state legislation. So it hasn't necessarily been an explicit organising concept for the way in which we think about ageing discrimination, although it has been there implicitly. And this implicit inclusion, let me illustrate by means of the Commonwealth Age Discrimination Act, which has been in force now for a decade and a half. Like other legislation, it doesn't include a specific reference to ageism or ageist, but it does obviously include some protection against differential treatment based on ageism. As I've said, not in explicit terms, but it talks about discrimination on the basis of harmful stereotypes or on the basis of characteristics ascribed to a particular age group. You can see this in the objects of the Act, which is interesting, and the relevant object is in section 3, and it talks about one of the Act wanting to respond to demographic change, an interesting way of describing things rather than, say, talking about human rights protection. And one of those ways of responding to demographic change is by changing negative stereotypes about older people, which is obviously one component, but certainly not the full compass of the concept of ageism. And it puts that, or it pays a nod, though not a particularly deep nod, I suppose, to the Madrid International Plan of Action on Aging, which is the current non-binding policy document adopted at the international level. And then it's seen, the ageism that's built in part is seen in the definition of direct age discrimination in section 14 of the Act, where less favourable treatment according to either a characteristic that does pertain to persons of the age or age group, or a characteristic that is imputed. So both correct and inaccurate or under-inclusive characteristics which are attributed to particular age groups. But that's pretty much it in terms of the conceptual framework and the explicit recognition of that. There is no provision that I'm aware of in which there's a general obligation on governments or others to adopt a campaign to eliminate ageism. And you can see, I think, the impact of the lack of that in the National Plan of Action on Abuse of Older Australians that was adopted last year, which does talk about ageism, but doesn't seem to build that need to respond to ageism into the overall program, although perhaps that is something that will evolve. So we've got those protections. They apply, as you know, to areas such as employment, goods and services, education and health and so on. What's the impact been? Well, it hasn't been especially effective, according to those who have looked at it in detail in providing protection and remedies in individual cases, let alone eliminating ageism across the board in areas such as employment more generally, health services, aged care and so on. It doesn't do a good job of dealing with intersectional forms of discrimination. As we know, age interacts with a whole range of different social and individual characteristics to provide particular forms of experience of ageism and discrimination. And perhaps most particularly, it doesn't really have any impact or much impact on the range of legislative schemes that embody ageist assumptions and policies. And indeed, the Age Discrimination Act contains a specific defence to a claim of age discrimination that the alleged discriminator has been acting in accordance with other statutes. And we don't have within our system a general or overriding protection, legal or otherwise, against ageist treatment law or policy. It's a similar situation on the international plane. The specific problem of ageism and indeed of age discrimination has been neglected on the international level. There's no explicit prohibition of age discrimination under the UN human rights treaties, with a minor exception. It has to be interpreted into the context of discrimination on the basis of other status. I've been unable to find any mention of the word ageism or ageist in the principal human rights treaties, nor do the words appear in any of the interpretive materials adopted by the treaty bodies, or indeed in the many hundreds of reports which have been adopted by the special thematic expert procedures of the UN Human Rights Council and its predecessor commission. The only exceptions are where you'd expect to find them: the independent expert on the human rights of older persons and the special rapporteur on the rights of persons with disability. Although, of course, one of the specialised agencies, the WHO, has a campaign on ageism. That can be contrasted with the situation in relation to sex discrimination, in which the CEDAW Convention contains an explicit obligation on states to eliminate prejudices and stereotypes and ideas about superiority, and also the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which has a similar explicit obligation in relation to eliminating stereotypes, prejudices, and harmful practice in relation to persons with disabilities. And that is one of the debates that is going on at the moment as to whether we need a new international convention which will contain a similar provision. Quick conclusion, what I think we need to do, we need to consider how better to articulate ageism as a problem that needs to be named, analysed and addressed in a coherent and comprehensive way, nationally and internationally. We need to link this to a campaign of social education and to incorporate it in policy development and evaluation frameworks. And we need to revisit existing age discrimination laws and their treatment of ageism, especially as regards the many exceptions to the operation of that law. And we need to put these in the context of a broader and coherent recognition of human rights, particularly in older age, both the national and international levels. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Andrew. All I have to say is hear, hear. Now, on to another completely different discipline. I'd like to introduce you to Professor Marion Baird, AO. She's a Professor of Gender and Employment Relations at the University of Sydney. She was the first female professor in industrial relations at the university. In 2018, she was appointed as a Pro-Chancellor of the University of Sydney and was also named in Apolitical's top 100 most influential people in gender equality. She was awarded an Order in Australia in 2016 for outstanding services to improving the quality of women's working lives and for contributions to tertiary education. Marion's research contributed to the introduction of Australia's paid parental leave scheme, and she is currently a CI on the Centre of Excellence in Population Ageing Research. Thank you, Marion. Today, Marion's going to talk to you about age, work and policies.
Thanks very much, Emma. And I'm delighted to be here. I also want to thank Karen and the UNSW Ageing Futures Institute for inviting me. Before I begin, I too would like to pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, their elders, as defined by Mick. Thank you for that introduction, Mick. Past, present and emerging. And I think it's especially important on this first day of NAIDOC week to recognise the Indigenous owners of our lands. So thank you. I'd like to bring a sort of a mix of my research together for my discussion here. And I'm going to canvass age, gender, work and the policies that we have in Australia in a very brief way, but hopefully to stimulate some discussion and consideration of where we might go to next in Australia as we consider that we have an ageing population and therefore an ageing workforce. And I think some of what I say springs nicely off what Andrew said as well, because it does go to this issue of policies. So I will just confirm, can you see my screen? I think I'm sharing it. Yes, thank you. Great. So one of the things I like to start with is to actually show you that there has been a really significant change in the composition of the Australian workforce. And the biggest shift has been the growth in the proportion of older women in our labour market. And what you've got there in front of you are what we call the employment curves of men and women in Australia from 1978 to 2018. And so the light bluish line is women in 1978, the standard pattern of women entering the labour market when they were up to about the ages 20 to 24, withdrawing from the labour market to have children, and then some returning to the labour market when they got older and then leaving. But you can see their rates hit just above 60% in the 1970s, but never get much higher, or don't get any higher than that right through their life course. And this period, which is where I did my original research about parental leave, I often refer to as the Nappy Valley, that time in women's working lives where they've left the workforce to look after young children. But compare that with women in Australia today, and we can see all through a massive increase in the proportion of women in the labour market, but particularly actually older women. One of the areas we haven't paid as much attention to is the growing and sustained participation rate of women from about 40 to 55 to 60. So that's been an enormous shift in our labour market, and it does raise a couple of tensions that I'll come to in a moment. By contrast, men's participation rates and employment rates overall have declined. So in about 1978, this was the upper yellow line, is the pattern of men's employment. And by the time we get to 2018, there's about a 10% decrease overall throughout men's working lives of their employment patterns. And we see a little burst here of men 60 and over staying in the labour market till they're older. So that's the sort of context I'm talking to in. I do a lot of research in the area of work and employment, and hence I'm really interested in this issue of ageism and what happens to men and women as we get older and work. And it's not a simple story. But that context, that labour market context, also sits against a government set of policies, federal government here. I've really kept them very brief. And there are two main ones. We have a policy that is aimed at keeping people in the workforce for longer, which we need to do because our population is ageing, and we need more people to work in order to feed the tax system and support the economy. And one of the main policy areas there has been the shift in the access to the aged pension, which used to be younger. It's now accessible at age 66, and the age at which that pension can be accessed will increase every 6 months until July 2023, when it'll be 67. So on the one hand, we've got policies that are arguing and promoting people's employment for longer in the paid labour market. On the other hand, we have a lot of policies and a very strong policy around care for older people, which we often refer to as ageing in place, which aims for the aged Australians to remain in their own homes rather than entering residential aged care. Now, I'm not even going to talk about the inquiries underway at the moment, but you can see that what has happened is that that combination of more women in the workforce for older ages and a policy and an older population and a policy of having our elderly people looked after at home has led to what I've called a care crunch. We have this huge pressure on older people, especially older women, to both work and look after their elders, usually their elderly parents or relatives with a disability. So this is leading to a very difficult situation in Australia for many women, older women, but increasingly is also becoming an issue for older men in the workforce. So I'm going to bring in some of the work we've been doing in the Centre of Excellence Population Ageing Research. This is a centre that Karen Anstey is a CI on as well. Last year, we conducted what's called the MWAS, the Mature Age Workers and Organisations Study, and we asked people, why do they continue working? And you can see here the reasons that they listed, and they could list more than one, but income was the main reason, perhaps not a surprise. It's also the only one where there's a statistically significant difference between the responses of males and females. So older females, 45 and up, and that's the definition of an older worker in Australia from the Australian Bureau of Statistics is 45 plus. So older women continue working for income. That's not the only reason they continue working, but it is a primary reason. For men, they do continue working for income, but you can see there's a range of other motivations for staying at work. So that signals one of the first things that we've heard a lot about. That is that women do need that income. Their superannuation balances are not as high as men's. They're often entering a period of age, older age, where they are single and coming into a need to supply and support themselves. But then we come to this issue of whether there's a bias at work. And here the picture is not as clear-cut as we might expect. As well as doing the MWAS survey in 2019, we repeated that survey. It's a nationally representative survey. We repeated it during COVID in May and June. And we asked people if they thought they were being biased against, and they had an age bias operating them against them at work. And here you see that, interestingly, men and women in the 45 to 54 age group do feel that they have an age bias, and women more than men. However, by the time they get to 55 and 64, the men are reporting much less age bias, and the women also not reporting such a huge age bias. But the older you get, the more bias that these people perceive is happening against them, particularly for women 65 and above. So yes, I think we could say we do have an age bias or some ageism operating in Australia for certain. And this can be sort of further understood if we think about people who are not in the labour market but would like to re-enter the labour market during this period of COVID again. We asked the unemployed, what role do you feel your age has played in receiving job offers? And we can see here that age is seen to really affect people's chances of having a job offer, especially for those people who are 55 to 64. So age considerably reduces the chances, it is perceived by workers between the ages of 55 to 64, more than the other age groups. So we do have this sense of it's very difficult to get into the labour market once you get older, and once you're in a job, there are areas certainly of significant age bias. But I'm not sure, and perhaps this is an area that we really don't know enough about yet empirically, what really is going on in the labour market. And we were quite concerned during COVID that COVID would affect older workers much more than younger workers. So the next slide I've got here is just a couple of conclusions we have from a qualitative study of employers and older workers. So we asked a range of employers in Australia how they responded to COVID in terms of staffing, and we were particularly interested in their attitudes and behaviours towards older workers. We'd heard a lot previous to COVID and through our other work about older workers' inability to deal with new technologies, perhaps, their lack of adaptability, their lack of flexibility. But in fact, what we found was that very few problems with older workers were coming through when it came from, this is through the eyes of their employers. They found that older workers had no problems with adapting to working from home, although they did note that younger workers had some difficulties in working from home, mostly due to their either less settled living arrangements or less spacious living arrangements. Just occasionally, mature workers had problems with technology, but these were resolved very quickly. So we've got this other view coming through here as well, that in reality and practice, older workers have adjusted to the requirements of COVID, the sudden need to work from home, reasonably well, and their employers were not seeing major differences there. So in conclusion, I'm sort of bringing all those areas of research together. I think we can say that there are actually no simple patterns occurring and therefore no simple conclusions. From my point of view, we see a very complex mix of age, work, the need to care for our elders and gender coming together. And this, especially for older women, creates a set of tensions around their financial needs as they age, their desire to interact socially, and also the requirements and responsibilities they carry in terms of care. And what I would conclude with then is that we really don't have a set of policy settings that are adequate to address these tensions and these complex interactions between age, work, care and gender and discrimination. And in fact, the policy settings we have at the moment may even exacerbate those tensions. So I'll leave it there. Thanks, Camille, and look forward to discussion.
Thank you, Marion. That very much resonated with me. I've been in that nappy valley three times, and now I'm in the middle of a care crunch.
Yeah.
Wow.
Right.
And how interesting for those of us that as we move into grandparenthood, going back into the nappy valley again, while simultaneously being crunched in care.
Exactly. That's a great title for a paper.
Yeah, let's. Okay, enough of me gaining from this wonderful talk. Now, from nappies and valleys to architecture and design. How wonderful is this? What a wonderful multidisciplinary input AFI has put together today. To Professor Bruce Judd, who's an emeritus professor at the University of New South Wales City Futures Research Centre. His previous appointments include Director of the Australian School of Architecture and Design and Inaugural Director of the University of New South Wales Centre of the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute. He's been an advisor to government on public housing estate renewal projects, and his research is focused on housing, urban design and human behaviour, most recently on population ageing and the built environment in both Australia and Japan. Professor Judd's going to be talking today about ageism in Australia, housing policy, design and markets. Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you, Carmel. Next slide, please. Yes, Carmel's already given us the definition, the World Health Organization definition for ageism, involving stereotyping, prejudice and discrimination against people on the basis of their age. What I'm going to argue is that I think it's widespread in Australian housing policy, the industry and in popular discourse. Stereotyping occurs in regard to claims about underutilisation of housing by older people, their need to downsize, and also the ideal, inverted commas, of the retirement village living. And discrimination occurs, I believe, in housing types and locations, the lack of accessible housing design, and also inadequate access to home care services. Next. Looking at underutilisation, we did some research on this some years ago, and we discovered that very few people actually believe that they underutilise their home, despite the fact that in official measures, 84% of older people aged 55 and over, underutilise their home, using a Canadian measure that the Australian government uses of underutilisation. You can see from the first line there that a high proportion of people are in 1 or 2 person households, in detached houses, and in houses with 3 or more bedrooms. And that was reflected in our survey as well. But 91% of our respondents regarded their home as suitable size for their needs. So there's a considerable disjunction between the official measures and what people think, older people think. When we dug into this, we found that 25% included temporary residents living in their home for 20 nights or more per year, but not counted in the census. And they also use spare bedrooms for things like office space, visiting family and friends, exercise equipment, hobbies, and a whole host of other things. And we have photographic evidence of this in our research. There was also a strong preference for ageing in place with care services when we gave them a list of options. And there was some concern about retirement village fees, regulations, and management on the part of quite a few people. Next, please. Our next project was done on downsizing, and surprising to us was that we found that during the 5-year period, 2006 to 2011, that only 18% of people 50 who'd moved since 50 years of age and over had actually moved. And only around half of those, according to our survey, would have downsized, which is a fairly small proportion of older people. Another study done by Melbourne University suggests that 30% of 55-year-olds had actually considered downsizing, indicating that there is a considerable potential there which is unmet at the moment. Now, our findings from those who had downsized between that 5-year period found that most did so within the general community and about 1/5 into retirement villages. Many of them went into separate houses, 44%, 28% to attached housing of some form, terrace houses, townhouses and the like, and 23% into flats or apartments. And most went into 2 or 3 bedroom dwellings, so smaller but not too small. And when we looked at retirement village estimates at the time from the Productivity Commission, only about 5.3% back then of 65s and over lived in retirement villages, so a fairly small sector of aged housing. And I just checked the other day the 2016 census, and it's 3% of 55s and over and 4.9% of 65s and over living in retirement villages, so a small sector. Next, please. Why were people downsizing? Well, mostly they were downsizing for lifestyle maintenance reasons, some because children had left home or due to retirement, fewer due to relationship breakdown, other sudden shocks like partner's death or illness or disability, but very rarely because of financial difficulties, which surprised us. What were they looking for? Mostly low maintenance, smaller dwellings and lifestyle improvement, which is pretty obvious from the above. They also, however, emphasised convenient location to shops, transport, health, aged care services, family and friends. So location was an important factor that they were looking for. And a more accessible or more modern home and reduction in living costs. Next, please. When we asked them had they encountered any difficulties in the process of downsizing, the biggest one was availability of suitable housing types, along with cost and affordability, and a little less important, availability of locations close to family and friends and services. We identified a number of barriers in that research to downsizing, 3 of them in fact. First one was dwelling and locational barriers, as just mentioned. Second was the costs of downsizing, which are often not appreciated. Real estate agents' fees, removalist fees, stamp duty, which can be very considerable on purchasing another house. And then there were practical and psychological factors, people's attachment to the home and neighbourhood, the stress involved in moving and in decluttering or selling off things that they couldn't afford to fit in their new home. Next, please. Regarding housing diversity and design, I think there is discrimination in the Australian housing market. There's a lack of appropriate housing types for ageing in place, which comes from our survey. There's inadequate accessible or universal housing design in Australian housing in the marketplace, and there's inadequate funding for home care services. So these 3 things are all important if we're going to encourage people to age in place. When it comes to housing diversity, we have 4 decades of national and state government policy rhetoric around the need for housing diversity given a demographic change, but little has actually happened. If you look at from 1996 to 2016, missing middle housing, as they call it, attached housing, other than flats and separate houses, has only grown from 10% to 14% over that period. Now, there have been some initiatives that governments have done. New South Wales stands out here with its State Environmental Planning Policy number 5, which has been revised a couple of times for seniors living. But what that provides is, even though it's private market housing, it provides housing in older enclaves, which a lot of people prefer not to live in. And there's also been recent missing middle policies developed in 3 states of Australia. The question, though, is that's fairly early in their implementation, and we're not sure how effective they will be in actually increasing housing diversity. Next, please. When it comes to housing and neighbourhood design, most of what's happened has happened in the disability area, which of course is relevant to age-friendly housing. The Australian Human Rights Commission introduced access to premises standards or guidelines, which eventually became embodied in the Building Code of Australia, but they're extremely minimal. For class 2 or multi-unit or apartment buildings, all it involves is level access from the entry to one floor and common areas, and nothing inside the actual individual dwellings. So they can get there, but they can't live there. In 2012, the federal government, in conjunction with peak bodies, brought out the livable housing guidelines with 3 levels of kind of accessibility: silver, gold, and platinum. These were voluntary, not mandatory, and they failed dismally to meet the 100% silver target by 2020. And more recently, in the last 3 years, the Australian Building Codes Board is undergoing a review of the access to premises building standards, which is happening at the moment. And they put out a consultation paper which shows a negative cost-benefit analysis for all levels of livable housing guidelines. However, the Melbourne Disability Institute and the Summer Foundation just very recently did another social cost-benefit analysis and indicated that livable housing guidelines at gold level for all housing actually was a positive cost-benefit. In the age-friendly neighbourhood and urban design, there's also been some things happening. Initially, the 2002 Disability Standards for Public Transport has a 30-year rollout and is in progress at the moment. In 2007, the World Health Organization's Age-Friendly Cities and Communities program was introduced, which has had an impact on some Australian states, but mostly at local government level. And in 2013, the Australian Human Rights Council brought out an advisory note on streetscape and outdoor areas, but which again is voluntary, so is probably not going to have very much effect unless it's made mandatory in the Building Code of Australia. Next, please. My last word is is going to be given to an older person who sent me a postcard with this written on it. We, the over 50s, want suitable housing, smaller, well-designed dwellings with 4 rooms that are 1 story without stairs, wider passageways, strong handrails in toilets and no front or back steps. P.S. I'm 103 centimetres tall, very wide, and weigh 130 kilograms. And my final remark is, surely this is not too much to ask. Thank you.
What a wonderful way to end. And in fact, as an expert on successful ageing and drumming into people over and over again the importance of planning, how do older people plan from a housing perspective for ageing in place? It's all very well to have these policies. Anyway, I'm turning this into a question. I'm highlighting what that's brought to me and how important that is. I'm not going to hijack the questions yet, but I will in a minute. Okay, we've got some questions coming in, but I'm going to completely use Chair's prerogative. Just quickly, sorry everyone, but you know, hey, I got the front row tickets to the best concert today anyway. Mick, can I ask you, your comments about setting a strengths-based example was so profound. And I think it's very interesting because talking about the need for future services and to watch us, how we, from the Royal Commission, very much, if you're in a situation where you're not using a lot of residential care, and then to see how we've stuffed up residential aged care in many ways, what have you learnt not to do? But on the other hand, you're perhaps at an extreme where you're in the care crunch and you've got a whole bunch of people who are needing more services or are being crunched by the need for care. But what can you learn? What have you learnt from us and how we've stuffed up? And you don't want to end up like us, hey?
No, I don't want to. I don't think anyone should end up in some of the conditions we see our old people looking in. I don't care whether it's, I feel the same way whether they're Aboriginal or Italian or anything. I think that's what we should be doing. And I think we all should be learning from the mistakes or the muck-ups that have been made in the past. And I said this to one of my friends who's a historian, an Aboriginal woman. She's a Quandamooka woman from Strait Island. And I said, I wonder why, I think I worked out why we have all the sorry business, because we still have these big extended families of cousins and second cousins, but we just call them cousins. And non-Indigenous people don't. She said, well, they did till 2 generations ago, when they sort of shrunk down into these nuclear families. And I see it in my own hometown of Rockhampton, where someone goes and gets a job in a mine and they live on one side of the river compared to the other, and they never see their families again, and they depart, apart by about 5 kilometres. Whereas Aboriginal people have this still have this collectiveness, and I think we should get a bit back to that for everyone. And we all know that people looked after in the home, whether they're old people or people with disabilities, and whatever disability is, a physical disability or a mental health issue, that they're better looked after out of those institutions. We know once people go into an institution, the outcomes are generally not real good. We know that. So what we should be doing is making sure that people who do have to go into those institutions have the best of everything, but the people who don't have to do that, how can we actually service them? And that's why I think the strength-based approach of that we still have around the collectiveness within our families is so important. And it's so important as we get to this stage, as we get older and older and older, and then we're getting into the end of life stuff. We had to do with my mum. My mum wanted to stay home. She refused dialysis, so we knew she was going to die, but we wanted her last months to be just at home rather than in a hospital, and lucky enough we achieved that, with the help from the system and the doctors and the nurses, who was just so great. So I think if we think about that, what can we do as a collective to make life better for the people who don't really have to go into these institutions? That's what I'd be aiming for. Although my youngest daughter she lives in Perth, and when I go and visit her and my other daughter, they see an ad for a old people's home and they just joke, Dad, that's where we're putting you. You won't have a say. We're just going to put you in there.
Mick, me too. Us too, I'm sure all of us. I've had similar threats from my children.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move. Thank you. That was wonderful. Let's move to some questions. I've actually got to make room for one other human being. There's a question to everybody, really, and anyone who'd like to answer, could you please just pop in? Why is ageism so pervasive?
I'll start by saying we've never addressed it as we do now, and until you start addressing this stuff, and not so long ago, not many people live to old age. The life expectancy in the Western world has increased so much in the last 80 and 90 years. So we didn't really think about it. And I think about people don't even think about age stuff until they're exposed to it. My great friend Susan Ryan, who passed away a few weeks back, her and I used to talk about people in the aged area. She was the age commissioner in the Human Rights Commission, never understood discrimination until they were discriminated against because they were old. Never saw discrimination before in their lives. and all of a sudden they're experiencing this discrimination, and they were basically traumatised by it. You know, when they put an ad up and say we want an energetic team, that means old people don't apply, you know, that sort of stuff. So I don't think it was such an issue till that long ago, because it's like I said, a couple of generations ago, everyone looked after their old people. There weren't that many old people homes around. So it wasn't such an issue till recently, I think.
Yes. So the answer to why is ageism so pervasive, it's because of the changing demographics. And in fact, not only is it pervasive, but it's actually getting worse because of the changing demographics. I might add, as a psychiatrist, I can explain that ageism is so pervasive because it's a form of psychological distancing. As all of us have this sense of aging anxiety, death anxiety, it's a way of saying, it's a way of distancing yourself. That person is not me. So it's very reassuring to say, I'm not that person, I'm not old. And that's why it's so pervasive. Okay, we might move to other questions. How can intergenerational connections counter ageism? I think Mick's kindly answered that question. The government often uses age groups to give social assistance. Is this an example of ageism? If not, what is the explanation? Anyone got a response to that, please? Using age groups to give social assistance.
I'll have a go at that if you like, Mel, because we saw some of this come through in the recent budget, this discussion about was it discrimination to have policies for young workers as opposed to old workers? And I think it goes back to that other issue of why is ageism pervasive? It's because we don't have enough resources to give everyone. So decisions have to be made somewhere along the line. And sometimes age is a clearer way of making a decision than some other criteria. So I think one of the reasons in policy is definitely that policies are targeted to particular groups. And you do need to do that in policy. But the problem is trying to ensure that the policies you target for one group don't have a negative impact on other groups. So we do need to think about ways of producing more equal outcomes for everyone through our policies. But you still may need to target, I think, policies to one group more than another group because their needs are different.
Anybody else want to comment?
Can I
Please.
Yep. Look, just going back to the ageism prevalence as well.
Oh, sorry, yes.
There's also, I think we also need to think about the whole range of what's included in ageism. There's that so-called benevolent ageism as well, which can translate into paternalism and so on. And there's a dominant culture of youth in our society, which has increased, and a whole sort of neoliberal economic value assessment of citizenship and people as economic actors in our society, and assumptions, often well-founded even on that basis, about the many contributions that people make as they get older. I think in terms of the age groups for governments, yes, there has to be some sort of targeting, but I think if one steps back, one could look at it. So for example, we all have a right to an adequate standard of living. Okay, and if you're 30 and out of a job and can't get a job, the government has an obligation to provide some sort of support. If you're 50 or 60, 70, can't get a job, it should be similar. And if you have decided you no longer want to engage in paid employment, then there's still an obligation. The form that may take may vary. It may be age-based. It has to be, but it has to be not exclusionary, I think. So our provisions in which the assumption is that people who reach pension age no longer continue to work and are no longer entitled to support on the basis they want to continue to work is clearly ageist, even though it comes from a policy of a sort of a crude allocation of benefits on age cohorts.
Thank you. Excellent. And Bruce, have you got any final words?
Yes, look, on that question of why so much ageism in the housing industry, I think it's a very so there's a lot of inertia in the industry. Builders and basically do what's worked in the past. And I think as somebody said before, kind of population aging has kind of snuck up on us really. and we're still relying on solutions that are geared around the kind of nuclear family, even though the nuclear family's changed as well, let alone considering things like multi-generational households, which exist as well. So I think, you know, this is a problem in the building industry. Buildings last a long time, and they tend to rely on solutions that have worked before, both in the market and in the way they construct and design things. And I think that's where the problem lies. We need a transformation into the real world of 2021.
On that note, we're all going to go back to the real world in our nappy valleys with our care crunches. Thank you so much for everybody. Certainly this was the Carmel Pisa private webinar. Very much enjoyed it. And I can see just a final comment someone's made, responding from the land of the Durag and Ghangulu people. Thank you, so relevant to us all in repeat care crunches. I think that's a beautiful final word, and everyone have a lovely day. Thank you.
Thank you.